The gunshot that rang out through the pre-dawn darkness of Wallace, Idaho, wasn't meant for anyone in particular. Just another drunk cowhand celebrating payday. But it still made Annie Zimmerman's hands shake as she carried the stack of dirty dishes through the back door of the Silver Spur Saloon. She had been awake for 22 hours straight, and the sound jolted through her exhausted body like electricity, nearly sending the plates crashing to the ground. She steadied herself against the doorframe, took a deep breath of the cool September air, and reminded herself why she was doing this. At home in the tiny shack at the edge of town, her two younger sisters and baby brother were sleeping, bellies full because of the bread and beans she had managed to bring home last night. That was enough. That had to be enough. It was 1883, and Wallace was a mining town that had sprung up almost overnight in the Idaho Territory, full of silver-hungry men and the people who made money off them. Annie had arrived here 6 months ago with her siblings after their parents had died in a wagon accident on the way to Oregon. They had been heading west for a better life, for the promise of land and opportunity. But instead, Annie had found herself stranded in a muddy mountain town with 3 children to feed and no money to continue the journey. She was 19 years old, and suddenly she was a mother to Lily, who was 12, Grace, who was 9, and little Thomas, who had just turned 6. The saloon job was her third of the day. She started each morning at 4 when she walked to the bakery owned by Mrs. Henderson, where she kneaded dough and cleaned ovens until 8. Then she rushed home to get the children ready for the day, made sure they had something to eat, and left them in Lily's capable if young hands before heading to her second job at the general store. There she stocked shelves, swept floors, and helped customers until 6 in the evening. Most people would have been exhausted after that, but Annie's day was only 2/3 finished. From 7 until 2 in the morning, she worked at the Silver Spur, washing dishes, cleaning tables, and occasionally serving drinks when Betty, the regular barmaid, needed help. She would stumble home through the dark streets, sleep for an hour or two, and then start all over again. The money from all 3 jobs barely covered their rent and food. There was nothing left for new clothes, which was why Grace's dress had patches on the patches, or for medicine, which was why Annie lived in constant fear that one of them would get sick. She had no time to think about her own future, no time to imagine what her life might have been like if her parents had lived, if they had made it to Oregon, if she had been able to finish growing up before being forced to become the sole provider for a family. She pushed through the back door of the saloon with her hip, balancing the dishes, and nearly collided with someone coming the other way. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her, and she looked up into a pair of dark blue eyes that seemed to see right through her exhaustion to something deeper underneath. "Careful there," the man said, his voice low and warm. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that needed cutting. He wore dusty traveling clothes and had the lean, muscular build of someone who worked hard for a living. "Didn't mean to startle you." "I'm fine," Annie said quickly, stepping back. She didn't have time for conversation, not when she still had 3 more hours of dishes waiting for her. "Excuse me." She tried to move past him, but he didn't immediately step aside. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, concern, maybe, or curiosity. "You work here?" "Yes," she said shortly. Then, because her mother had raised her with manners even if life had tried to grind them out of her, she added, "Can I help you with something?" "Just looking for a room for the night," he said, "and maybe some information about work around here. I'm a ranch hand, good with horses, decent with cattle. Name is Dalton Davies." "Mrs. Murray handles the rooms," Annie said, gesturing toward the front of the saloon. "As for work, You would want to talk to Mr. Peterson at the Bar P Ranch about 5 miles north of town, or the mining companies are always hiring if you don't mind going underground." "Not much for mining," Dalton said with a slight smile. "Prefer to see the sky. You from around here?" "No," Annie said, and something in her voice must have warned him not to ask more because he nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. "Thank you for the information, Miss Zimmerman," she said despite herself. "Annie Zimmerman." "Miss Zimmerman," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Maybe I'll see you around." Annie didn't answer, just hurried past him into the kitchen where the mountain of dirty dishes was waiting. She didn't have time to think about tall cowboys with kind eyes and voices that made her feel, just for a moment, like she wasn't completely alone in the world. She had 3 children depending on her and 3 jobs to juggle, and no room in her life for anything else. But over the next few days, she kept seeing him. Dalton Davies seemed to be everywhere in Wallace's small downtown area. She saw him coming out of the Bar P Ranch office, presumably hired since he was smiling. She saw him at the general store buying supplies, and he tipped his hat to her as she restocked the canned goods. She saw him at the bakery early one morning, buying bread from Mrs. Henderson, and he held the door for her as she left after her shift. "You're up early," he commented, falling into step beside her even though she hadn't invited him to. "I'm always up early," Annie said, too tired to be polite. She had gotten even less sleep than usual because Thomas had had a cough that kept him up half the night, and she had stayed with him, rocking him and singing the songs their mother used to sing. 3 jobs, Dalton said, and it wasn't a question. "That's what Betty told me when I asked about you. Bakery, general store, and the saloon." "Betty talks too much," Annie muttered, but she wasn't really angry. Betty was kind to her, always making sure she ate something during her shift at the Silver Spur, always offering advice that Annie was too proud to take. "She's worried about you," Dalton said quietly. "Says you're working yourself to death." "I'm doing what I have to do," Annie said, stopping in the middle of the street to face him. The sun was just starting to come up over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and in that light she could see that Dalton's eyes were even bluer than she had thought. "I have 3 siblings to take care of. Our parents died, and there's nobody else. So yes, I work 3 jobs, and yes, I'm tired, but that's my business, not yours, and certainly not Betty's." She expected him to back off, maybe to get defensive or angry at her tone. Instead, he just looked at her with that same expression of concern and something else she was afraid to name. "How old are you?" he asked. 19, she said. "Old enough to take care of my family." "Old enough to accept help when it's offered," he said, "if anyone was offering." "Nobody's offering," Annie said flatly, "and I don't need charity." "Didn't say anything about charity," Dalton replied. "But maybe I'll think of something that isn't." He tipped his hat to her and walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the street feeling off balance and strangely hopeful, which was worse than feeling nothing at all. That Sunday, she had a few hours free in the afternoon, a rare gap between her morning shift at the bakery and her evening shift at the saloon. She used the time to take the children on a walk outside of town, letting them run and play in the grass near the creek. Lily helped her spread out their thin blanket and unpack the small lunch she had managed to put together: bread, cheese, and apples that were slightly bruised but still good. Thomas was chasing grasshoppers with more enthusiasm than success, his cough from earlier in the week finally gone. Grace was braiding grass stems into chains, her tongue stuck out in concentration. Lily sat beside Annie, looking older than 12, her eyes too serious as she watched her younger siblings play. "You look tired," Lily said quietly. "I'm fine," Annie said automatically. "You always say that," Lily said. But you're not fine. You never sleep, Annie. You never eat enough. You give us everything and keep nothing for yourself." "That's what family does," Annie said, putting her arm around Lily's thin shoulders. "That's what Mama and Papa would have wanted." "They wouldn't have wanted you to kill yourself taking care of us," Lily said, and her voice cracked on the words. "Sometimes I love Grace and Thomas, but I wish it was just you and me. Then you wouldn't have to work so hard." "Don't say that," Annie said firmly. "Don't ever say that. We're a family, all four of us, and we take care of each other. You help so much, Lily. I couldn't do any of this without you watching them during the day." "I could get a job too," Lily offered, not for the first time. "I could work at the bakery or—" "No," Annie said. "You're going to school. You're learning to read and write properly, and you're going to have a better life than this. That's not negotiable." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Thomas finally catch a grasshopper and immediately let it go, laughing as it jumped away. Then Grace called out, "Annie, look! There's a man on a horse." Annie looked up and felt her heart do something complicated when she recognized Dalton Davies riding toward them on a handsome bay gelding. He was leading another horse, a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze on her face. "Miss Zimmerman," he called out, dismounting with easy grace. "Thought I might find you out here." "How did you know where to look?" Annie asked, standing up and brushing grass from her worn skirt. "Wallace isn't that big," he said with a slight smile. "And Betty mentioned, you sometimes bring the children to the creek on Sunday afternoons." He looked at Lily and the younger children with genuine interest. "These must be your siblings." "This is Lily, Grace, and Thomas," Annie said, unable to keep the note of pride from her voice. "Children, this is Mr. Davies. He's new in town." "You can call me Dalton," he said, crouching down to Thomas's level. "That's a mighty big grasshopper you almost caught there." "It jumped away," Thomas said sadly. "They always jump away." "That's what grasshoppers do best," Dalton said seriously. "But you know what else is good at jumping? Horses. Want to see?" Thomas's eyes went wide and Grace came running over, interested. Even Lily looked curious despite her attempt to seem grown up and unimpressed. "Is that safe?" Annie asked, her protective instincts immediately alert. "Safest thing in the world," Dalton assured her. "This here is Clover. She's the gentlest mare you'll ever meet. Belongs to the Bar P, but Peterson lets me use her for riding lessons." "Riding lessons," Annie repeated. "I've been giving some of the ranch owner's grandchildren lessons," Dalton said. "Figured I could use the extra money and I like teaching. Thought maybe your siblings might enjoy learning to ride." "We can't afford," Annie started to say. "Didn't ask you to pay," Dalton interrupted gently. "Thought maybe we could trade. You know this town better than I do, know the people, know how things work. Maybe you could help me get settled in, introduce me around, tell me which stores give fair prices and which ones to avoid. In exchange, I teach your siblings to ride. Fair trade, not charity." Annie wanted to refuse. She wanted to maintain her pride and her independence and not accept anything from anyone. But then she looked at Thomas's hopeful face, at Grace bouncing on her toes with excitement, even at Lily's carefully concealed interest, and she couldn't do it. "One lesson," she said. "We'll see how it goes." Dalton's smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "One lesson. Deal." For the next hour, Annie watched as Dalton patiently taught her siblings the basics of being around horses. He showed them how to approach Clover calmly, how to pet her, how to stand beside her without frightening her. He lifted Thomas onto her back and led the mare in slow circles while Thomas whooped with delight. Grace went next, trying to look brave even though Annie could see her hands shaking with nervousness. By the end of her turn, Grace was grinning from ear to ear. Even Lily, who had tried to act too old for such things, ended up on Clover's back, and Annie saw her sister actually smile, something that happened too rarely these days. "You're good with them," Annie said to Dalton as he lifted Lily down. "Patient." "I like children," he said simply. "Had 7 younger siblings back home in Kansas. I was the oldest, so I helped raise them." "Was?" Annie asked, catching the past tense. "They're all grown now, or mostly grown," Dalton said. "Didn't need me anymore, so I headed west to find my own way. Thought maybe I'd start a ranch of my own someday, breed horses." He looked at her seriously. "I know what it's like to be responsible for children, Annie. I know how hard it is and how tired you get and how sometimes you feel like you're drowning and nobody sees it." Annie felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She couldn't afford to cry, couldn't afford to be weak, couldn't afford to let anyone see how close to breaking she really was. "I'm managing," she said, but her voice came out rough. "I know you are," Dalton said. "But you don't have to manage alone. Let me help. Not charity, not pity, just one person helping another because it's the right thing to do." "Why?" Annie asked. "You don't even know us." "I know enough," Dalton said. "I know you're working yourself to death to keep your family together. I know you get up at 4 in the morning and don't go to bed until 3. I know you give your siblings your share of the food when you think nobody's looking. I know you're brave and strong and stubborn, and I know you need help whether you'll admit it or not." "How do you know all that?" Annie whispered. "I pay attention," Dalton said. "And I asked around. People in this town think highly of you, Annie. They wish they could help, but they know you're too proud to accept it. So I'm not offering it as help. I'm offering it as friendship, as trade, as whatever you need it to be so you'll say yes." Annie looked at her siblings, still laughing and petting Clover, looking happier than they had in months. She looked at Dalton, at his honest eyes and his open expression, and she felt something in her chest crack open just a little. "More lessons?" she asked. "For them, as many as they want," Dalton said. "Every Sunday afternoon, if that works for you, and maybe a few evenings during the week for Thomas when he gets better at it." "What do you really want from me?" Annie asked, because she had learned the hard way that nothing in life was truly free. "Maybe I just want to get to know you better," Dalton said quietly. "Would that be so terrible?" Annie didn't know how to answer that, so she just nodded and called to the children that it was time to head back to town. As they walked back, Thomas slipped his hand into Dalton's without hesitation, chattering about horses and grasshoppers and everything else in his 6-year-old world. Grace walked on Dalton's other side, asking questions about Clover and how old she was and what she ate. Lily walked beside Annie, and when their eyes met, Lily smiled knowingly in a way that made Annie blush. Over the next few weeks, Dalton became a regular part of their lives. He showed up every Sunday without fail for the riding lessons, bringing apples for the horses and candy for the children, which he claimed was just stuff he had found in his saddlebags. He started appearing at the general store during Annie's shift, always needing to buy something, always taking time to talk with her about his work at the Bar P Ranch. He told her about the horses he was training, about Peterson's plans to expand the herd, about the other ranch hands and their various quirks and personalities. In return, Annie found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone, about her parents and how much she missed them, about the night of the accident when a wheel had broken on the wagon and it had rolled down an embankment, killing both her mother and father instantly while she and the children were thrown clear, about how she still had nightmares where she heard her mother screaming, about how scared she was all the time that she wouldn't be enough, that she would fail the children, that something would happen to one of them and it would be her fault. "It won't be your fault," Dalton said one evening as they sat on the steps outside the general store after her shift had ended. The children were at home with Lily in charge, and Annie had 30 minutes before she needed to be at the saloon. You're doing everything humanly possible and then some. Whatever happens, Annie, it won't be because you didn't try hard enough." "How can you be sure?" Annie asked. "Because I see how hard you try," Dalton said. "Everyone does. Those children love you, Annie. They know how much you sacrifice for them." "Love doesn't put food on the table," Annie said bitterly. "No," Dalton agreed, "but it's still worth something. It's worth everything, actually." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Then Dalton said, carefully, as if he had been thinking about this for a while, "I got a promotion at the ranch." "That's wonderful," Annie said, and meant it. "You've only been here a month." "Peterson likes my work," Dalton said. "He's making me foreman. It comes with a raise and a cabin on the ranch property. 3 rooms, nothing fancy, but solid and warm and mine for as long as I work there." "You must be proud," Annie said. "I'm thinking about the future," Dalton said. "About what I want and what I need and what I'm ready for." Something in his tone made Annie's heart beat faster. She looked at him and found him already looking at her, his expression serious and hopeful and nervous all at once. "Annie," he said, "I know we haven't known each other long. I know you've got every reason to be cautious and to focus on your family and to not trust anyone who comes along offering things that seem too good to be true. But I need you to know something." "What?" Annie whispered. "I'm falling in love with you," Dalton said simply. "Maybe I have been since the first moment I saw you in the saloon, looking exhausted and beautiful and so damned brave it made my chest hurt. I'm in love with you, Annie Zimmerman, and I want to help you. Not because I pity you, not because I want something from you, but because I love you and I can't stand watching you work yourself to death when I could make things easier." "Dalton," Annie started, but he held up his hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I'm not proposing. Not yet, anyway. I know it's too soon and you barely know me and you need time. But I'm asking you to think about something. I'm asking you to consider quitting one of your jobs. The saloon, maybe, since that's the most dangerous and it keeps you up latest. I'll help make up the difference in money." "Not charity," he added quickly as Annie opened her mouth to protest. "A loan, if that makes you feel better, or payment for helping me learn about the town and the people, or whatever you need it to be. But please, Annie, let me help you. You don't need 3 jobs anymore. One of those jobs can be mine now." Annie felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't take your money. I can't be dependent on someone else. I can't. What if you leave? What if something happens? What if you change your mind?" "I won't," Dalton said, moving closer and taking her hands in his. "Annie, I know you've lost people. I know you're scared to depend on anyone because everyone you've depended on has either died or disappeared. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, I'm staying, and I want to be part of your life if you'll let me." "Why?" Annie asked through her tears. "Why would you want to take on me and 3 children and all our problems?" "Because I love you," Dalton said again, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Because Thomas makes me laugh and Grace reminds me of my youngest sister and Lily is one of the smartest people I've ever met. Because when I think about my future, about that ranch I want to start someday, I can't imagine it without you in it. Because you're the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I don't want to spend my life without you." Annie looked at their joined hands, at his strong fingers wrapped around her work-roughened ones, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months' hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind that just keeps you moving through another day, but the kind that makes you think maybe the future could be different, could be better, could be good. "1 job," she said slowly. "I could quit the saloon. That would mean I could sleep more, could spend more time with the children." She looked up at Dalton. "But I'm paying you back. Every cent. When I get on my feet properly, when things are better, I'm paying you back." "Deal," Dalton said, smiling so wide she couldn't help but smile back. And Annie, yes, can I court you properly? Take you to dinner, go on walks, spend time together without you falling asleep on your feet. Annie laughed, the sound surprising her because she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that. Yes, she said. You can court me properly, Dalton Davies. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Annie felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they pulled apart, she was breathless and blushing and happier than she had been in longer than she could remember. I need to get to the saloon, she said reluctantly. To give my notice. Want me to come with you? Dalton offered. No, Annie said. This is something I need to do myself, but thank you for everything. Thank me by getting some sleep tonight, Dalton said. And by letting me take you and the children out for lunch tomorrow after church. We don't have church clothes, Annie said, old shame rising up. So we'll go on a picnic instead, Dalton said easily. Bring the children, bring Lily's books that she loves, bring whatever makes you all happy. I just want to spend time with you. Annie nodded, not trusting herself to speak around the lump in her throat. She walked to the saloon feeling like she was floating, and when she gave her notice to the owner, he actually looked relieved. Been worried about you, Miss Annie, he said. You're a good worker, but you've been dead on your feet for weeks. Glad you're taking care of yourself. Someone's helping me take care of myself, Annie admitted. The owner grinned. That new foreman from the bar heard he's been sniffing around you. Good man from what I hear. Treat him right. I intend to, Annie said, and she meant it. That night she went home at 7 instead of 2 in the morning. She found Lily sitting up with a book, startled by Annie's early return. What's wrong? Lily asked immediately, fear in her eyes. Nothing's wrong, Annie said, sitting beside her sister. Everything's right, actually. I quit the saloon job. You what? Lily stared at her. But Annie, we need the money. We'll manage, Annie said. Dalton is helping us. And before you say anything, she added, seeing Lily's expression, it's not charity. We're paying him back. But he cares about us, Lily, about all of us, and I care about him. You love him, Lily said, and it wasn't a question. I think I do, Annie admitted. Is that crazy? We've only known him a month. Mama used to say she knew she loved Papa after 2 weeks, Lily said softly. She said when you know, you know. I know, Annie said. I know he's good and kind and patient. I know he makes me feel safe for the first time since we lost Mama and Papa. I know he loves the 3 of you almost as much as I do, and I know I want to see where this goes. Lily hugged her tightly. I'm glad, she said. You deserve to be happy, Annie. You deserve to have someone take care of you for once. Over the next few months, Dalton became woven into the fabric of their lives. He had lunch with them every Sunday after church. Annie had used some of the extra money from not working the saloon job to buy them all decent church clothes, and it felt good to walk into the small Wallace church with her head held high. He took Thomas riding twice a week, and the little boy started following him around like a puppy, hero worship clear in his eyes. He brought Grace books from the ranch owner's library, discovering that she loved stories about far-off places and adventures. He and Lily would have long conversations about everything from politics to philosophy, and Annie would watch them discuss some point with equal seriousness and feel her heart swell with affection. And with Annie, Dalton was patient and gentle and romantic in ways she had never imagined. He brought her wildflowers picked from the meadows around the ranch. He saved her the biggest pieces of chicken when they had picnics. He held her hand as they walked through town, not caring who saw, making it clear that he was proud to be courting her. He kissed her goodnight on the porch of their little shack, sweet kisses that left her breathless and wanting more, but never pushing, never demanding, always letting her set the pace. In December, 3 months after that first conversation on the general store steps, Dalton invited the whole family to the Bar P Ranch for Sunday dinner. Peterson, the ranch owner, was a kindly older man who had made his fortune in silver mining before deciding he preferred raising horses. His wife had died years ago, but his daughter and her family lived on the ranch, and they welcomed Annie and her siblings warmly. After dinner, while the children were playing with Peterson's grandchildren, Dalton asked Annie to walk with him. They strolled down to the barn where his own horse, a handsome chestnut stallion named Red, was stabled. "I wanted to show you something," Dalton said, leading her past the stalls to a small office at the back of the barn. He lit a lantern and Annie saw that the walls were covered with sketches and plans. "What are these?" she asked, moving closer to examine them. "Plans for my ranch," Dalton said. "The one I want to start someday. I've been working on them for years, ever since I was a teenager. See, here's the main house. I always imagined it with a big kitchen because my mama always said the kitchen was the heart of the home. And here are the stables, built in a U-shape so they're protected from the winter winds. And here are the paddocks and pastures." Annie traced the lines with her finger, seeing the dream he had drawn. "It's beautiful," she said. "When do you think you'll be able to start building it?" "That depends," Dalton said, and something in his voice made her look up at him. He was watching her with an expression that was nervous and hopeful and loving all at once. "Annie, I know we've only been courting for 3 months. I know it's fast, but I also know what I want, and I want you. I want to marry you. I want to adopt Thomas and Grace and Lily if they'll have me. I want to build this ranch with you by my side. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to give you and the children the life you deserve, the security you need. I want everything with you, Annie Zimmerman." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple gold band with a small but pretty diamond. "I'm not rich," he said. "Not yet, anyway. But I'm good at what I do. I'm a hard worker. And Peterson is planning to retire in a few years, and he's hinted that he might sell me this ranch at a good price if I can save up enough for a down payment. We could build a good life here, Annie. Will you marry me?" Annie looked at the ring, then at the plans on the wall, then at Dalton's face, and she felt her answer in every cell of her body. "Yes," she said, and then louder. "Yes, yes, yes." Dalton laughed and swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the small space of the office. When he set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with a passion that made her forget everything except the feeling of his arms around her and his lips on hers. "I love you," she said when they finally pulled apart. "I love you so much it scares me." "Don't be scared," Dalton said, resting his forehead against hers. "I've got you. I've got all of you, and I'm not letting go." They told the children that evening, and Thomas cheered. Grace cried happy tears, and Lily just smiled and said she had known it was coming. They told Peterson, who clapped Dalton on the back and said he had known the boy would settle down eventually. They told everyone they met in Wallace, and people smiled and congratulated them because everyone knew Annie's story, and everyone was glad to see something good happen to her. They were married in January of 1884 in the small Wallace church, with half the town in attendance. Annie wore a dress that Dalton had bought for her, simple but beautiful, made of cream-colored silk that must have cost him a month's wages. Lily was her bridesmaid, standing beside her with pride written all over her face. Thomas and Grace stood up with Dalton, both of them wearing new clothes and looking scrubbed and happy. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, there was only warm silence. When Dalton kissed her as his wife, the congregation cheered. And when they walked out of the church into the cold January sunshine, Annie felt like she was walking into a new life, one where she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. They moved into the foreman's cabin at the Bar P Ranch, and it was like a palace compared to the shack they had been living in. There were 3 rooms, a bedroom for Annie and Dalton, one for the girls, and one for Thomas, plus a kitchen and a living area with a real fireplace. There was glass in the windows and a roof that didn't leak and floors that didn't have gaps where the wind came through. Annie cried the first night they slept there, overwhelmed by the sudden change in their circumstances. Dalton held her in their bed, stroking her hair and letting her cry until she was empty. "It's going to take some getting used to," he said gently. "Being safe, being warm, having enough. But you'll get there, Annie, we all will." "What if it doesn't last?" Annie whispered. "What if something happens?" "Something might happen," Dalton said honestly. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, but whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Annie. You're never going to be alone again." Annie quit her job at the general store after the wedding, though she kept the one at the bakery because she genuinely enjoyed it, and Mrs. Henderson had become a friend. With only one job and Dalton's salary, they had more than enough money. There was extra for new clothes when they needed them, for medicine if someone got sick, even for little treats like candy or books. More importantly, there was time. Time for Annie to sleep a full night and wake up rested. Time to help the children with their schoolwork. Time to learn how to be a wife to Dalton, to discover what he liked for breakfast and how he preferred his coffee and the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. Time to fall more in love with him every single day. She discovered that he sang while he worked, old cowboy songs that he taught to Thomas. She learned that he had a wicked sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh until her sides hurt. She found out that he was ticklish on his ribs, and that he liked her to read to him in the evenings, and that he always made sure she was warm enough at night, even if it meant giving up his own blankets. In turn, he learned everything about her. He learned that she had nightmares about the accident, and that the only thing that helped was him holding her and reminding her that she was safe. He discovered that she loved wildflowers, especially the purple lupines that grew in the meadows in spring. He found out that she had a beautiful singing voice that she rarely used because she thought she wasn't good enough. He learned to read her moods, to know when she needed space and when she needed comfort, when she wanted to talk and when she just wanted to be held. The children thrived in their new life. Thomas, who had been too small and sickly, grew stronger with regular meals and warm clothes. He spent every moment he could with Dalton, learning about horses and ranching and everything else Dalton could teach him. Grace blossomed with access to books and education, becoming the top student in her class at the Wallace School. And Lily, who had been forced to grow up too fast, started to relax and be a child again, making friends her own age and laughing more than Annie had heard her laugh in years. In April, Dalton came home with news. "Peterson wants to retire," he said, unable to contain his excitement. "He's ready to sell the ranch. He's offering it to me for a price I can almost afford if I can make a down payment." "How much do we have saved?" Annie asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Not quite enough," Dalton admitted. "But I've been thinking. What if we took on a partner? Someone who knows horses like I do, someone trustworthy who could invest some money and work with me to build the ranch up. Peterson's nephew, maybe he's a good man, lives in Boise, and he's been looking for an opportunity like this." "Do it," Annie said without hesitation. "Chase your dream, Dalton. We'll make it work." Over the next few months, Dalton negotiated with Peterson and his nephew, a man named Samuel who turned out to be everything Dalton had promised: skilled, fair, and hardworking. They formed a partnership, bought the ranch, and immediately started making plans to expand it into the horse breeding operation Dalton had always dreamed of. Annie threw herself into making the ranch a success. She took over the household management, learning how to cook for a crew of ranch hands, how to keep accounts and manage money, how to plan and organize and make sure everything ran smoothly. It was work, but it was different from the exhausting grind of her 3 jobs. This work had purpose, had a future, was building towards something instead of just surviving day to day. In September, almost a year after she had met Dalton in the back doorway of the Silver Spur Saloon, Annie discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton one evening after the children were in bed, nervous about how he would react. His face lit up like the sun. "A baby," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Annie, we're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked. "I know we've already got 3 children and we're trying to build the ranch and I'm over the moon," Dalton said, kissing her soundly. "I love Thomas and Grace and Lily like they're my own, but to have a baby with you, Annie, that's everything I could want." The children were equally excited when they told them. Thomas wanted to know if the baby would be able to ride horses. Grace wanted to know if it would be a boy or a girl. Lily just hugged Annie tightly and said she would help with everything. The pregnancy was not easy. Annie was sick for the first few months, unable to keep much food down, exhausted all the time. Dalton hovered over her constantly, making sure she rested, bringing her water and crackers, rubbing her feet when they swelled. The children helped more around the house, taking on extra chores without being asked, being quieter so Annie could rest. In May of 1885, after a long and difficult labor, Annie gave birth to a son. They named him Daniel after Dalton's father, and he was perfect 10 tiny fingers and 10 tiny toes, a head full of dark hair, and lungs that worked just fine, as he proved by crying lustily for his first meal. Dalton held his son with tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect," he kept saying. "Annie, he's perfect. We made him," Annie said, exhausted but happy. "You and me, we made a perfect baby." Thomas and Grace and Lily crowded around to see their new brother, cooing over him and arguing gently about who he looked like. Lily declared he had Annie's nose. Grace said he had Dalton's chin. Thomas just wanted to know when the baby would be big enough to play with. Those first few weeks with a newborn were exhausting, but Annie had help this time. Dalton took over many of the night feedings, walking the floor with Daniel when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint. Lily helped watch the baby during the day so Annie could rest. Grace and Thomas tried their best to be helpful, even if sometimes that meant making more work rather than less. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Word spread about the quality of horses that Dalton and Samuel were raising, and buyers came from as far away as California and Colorado. The partnership worked well, with Samuel handling much of the business side while Dalton focused on training and breeding. They hired more ranch hands, built new stables, expanded the pastures. By the time Daniel was a year old, they were turning a real profit. Dalton and Annie sat down one evening and looked at the accounts with amazement. "We're not rich," Dalton said, "but we're doing well, more than well." "We're secure," Annie said, and the word felt like a miracle. "The children are fed and clothed and educated. We have a good home, a successful business, money saved for emergencies." "Dalton, we made it." "You made it," Dalton said, taking her hand. "You kept your family together through the worst circumstances imaginable. You worked 3 jobs and sacrificed everything, and you never gave up." "I just helped a little at the end." "You did more than help a little," Annie said. "You saved us. You gave us a future. You gave me love and partnership in this beautiful life. I'll never forget what it was like before, Dalton, but I also don't have to live there anymore, because of you." "Because of us," Dalton corrected, pulling her into his lap. "We saved each other, Annie. I was just drifting before I met you, working from ranch to ranch with no real purpose. You gave me a reason to build something permanent, to plan for a future, to want more than just the next job." They kissed in the lamplight of their comfortable home, and Annie thought about the terrified, exhausted girl she had been just 2 years ago, working herself to death in 3 different jobs, sure she would never be able to give her siblings the life they deserved. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. Thomas turned 8 and started helping more on the ranch, shadowing Dalton whenever he could, learning everything about horses and cattle and ranch management. Grace turned 11 and discovered a talent for drawing, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with pictures of the horses and the mountains and her family. Lily turned 14 and started showing an interest in the accounts and business side of the ranch, working with Samuel to learn bookkeeping and finance. In the spring of 1887, Annie discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she wasn't worried about how they would manage. This time, she was simply happy, excited to add another member to their growing family. "Boy or girl, I don't care," Dalton said, his hand on her belly, "as long as you're both healthy." In November, Annie gave birth to a daughter. They named her Rose after Annie's mother, and she was tiny and perfect with Annie's red hair and Dalton's blue eyes. Daniel, now 2.5, was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to touch her gently and bring her his toys. The family felt complete now: Annie and Dalton, Thomas and Grace and Lily, Daniel and baby Rose. 7 people who loved each other, who worked together, who had built something good and strong and lasting. On a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1888, they all rode out to the same creek where Annie and Dalton had first really talked, where he had given the children their first riding lesson, where so much of their story had begun. They spread out blankets and unpacked a large lunch, and the children ran and played in the water while Daniel toddled after them and Rose napped in a basket in the shade. "You remember the first time we came here?" Dalton asked, sitting beside Annie and taking her hand. "I remember thinking you were crazy," Annie admitted, "offering to help us when you barely knew us, talking about teaching the children to ride like it was no big deal. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," Dalton said, "and the bravest. I knew right then that I wanted to help you, wanted to be part of your life somehow. I just didn't know if you would let me." "You were patient," Annie said. "You didn't push. You didn't demand. You just kept showing up and being kind and making it impossible not to fall in love with you." "Best decision I ever made," Dalton said. "Coming to Wallace, taking that job at the Bar P, walking into the Silver Spur that night and nearly colliding with you in the doorway. You changed everything," Annie said softly. "You looked at me when I was working 3 jobs just to survive and you said, 'You only need one now.' You gave me back my life, Dalton." "We gave each other our lives," Dalton said, kissing her forehead, "and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." They watched Thomas helping Grace fish in the creek, watched Lily reading a book under a tree while keeping an eye on Daniel, watched the sunlight dance on the water and paint everything golden. Rose woke up and Annie nursed her while Dalton told her about his plans to expand the ranch again, to buy more land to the north, to increase the herd. "We'll need to hire more hands," he said. "And Samuel wants to build a bigger barn. It's a lot of work ahead of us." "We can handle it," Annie said confidently. "We can handle anything together." And they could. Over the next few years, they faced challenges: a harsh winter that tested their resources, a disease that ran through part of the herd, the death of old Peterson, who they had both loved. But they faced everything together, as a family, and they came through stronger each time. Thomas grew into a fine young man, skilled with horses and eager to take on more responsibility at the ranch. Grace's artistic talent blossomed, and she started selling her paintings to visitors who came to the ranch to buy horses. Lily went to a teaching college in Boise and came back to Wallace to teach at the school, making Annie proud beyond words. Daniel and Rose grew up surrounded by love and security, never knowing what it was like to be hungry or cold or afraid. In 1895, on their 11th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised Annie with a trip. Samuel and his wife agreed to watch the younger children, and Thomas and Grace were old enough to help manage things at the ranch. Dalton took Annie to San Francisco for a week, and they stayed in a real hotel with indoor plumbing and electric lights, went to the theater, walked along the waterfront, acted like young lovers without responsibilities. "This is amazing," Annie said, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. "I never imagined I would see something like this." "You deserve every beautiful thing in the world," Dalton said, his arm around her shoulders. "You deserve so much more than I can give you." "You've given me everything that matters," Annie said. "Love, family, security, partnership. What more could I possibly want?" "I don't know," Dalton said with a smile, "but I'll keep trying to figure it out for the rest of my life." They went home to Wallace renewed and refreshed, ready to tackle whatever came next. The ranch continued to prosper. Their children continued to grow and thrive. Their love continued to deepen with every passing year. In 1900, Thomas announced that he wanted to start his own smaller ranch on a piece of land adjacent to theirs, focusing on cattle rather than horses. Dalton helped him get started, lending him money and cattle and advice. By the end of the year, Thomas was engaged to a sweet girl from Wallace, and Annie cried at the wedding, remembering the scared 6-year-old boy who used to chase grasshoppers by the creek. Grace got married the following year to a man who owned a bookstore in Spokane, and she moved away but visited often, always bringing her latest paintings to show them. Lily fell in love with another teacher and married him in a quiet ceremony, setting up house in Wallace near the school where they both taught. Daniel showed every sign of following in his father's footsteps with horses. Rose, at 13, was already showing interest in running the business side of the ranch, working with the accounts the way Lily once had. One evening in 1903, Annie and Dalton sat on the porch of the main house they had built 5 years earlier, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. They were in their early 40s now, their hair showing threads of silver, their faces lined with years of sun and wind and laughter. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Annie asked, her hand in his. "All the time," Dalton admitted. "I think about what would have happened if I hadn't walked into that saloon that night, if I hadn't asked around about you, if I hadn't been brave enough to tell you I was falling in love with you. I think about what would have happened if I had been too proud to accept your help," Annie said. "If I had kept working those 3 jobs until I collapsed, if I had never let you into our lives." "We were lucky," Dalton said. "Lucky to find each other, lucky to have the chance to build this life together." "It wasn't just luck," Annie said. "It was choice. Every day we chose each other. We chose love. We chose to work together, to face problems together, to build something good and lasting. That's not luck, that's commitment." "You're right," Dalton said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "And I choose you every day, Annie Davies. I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life." "And I choose you," Annie said. "My cowboy who walked into my life when I was at my lowest and said, 'You only need one job now.' My partner, my love, my everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out, one by one, filling the sky with light. Inside the house, they could hear Daniel and Rose laughing about something, their voices young and carefree. From the smaller house down the road, they could see lights in Thomas's windows. They knew Grace was happy in Spokane, and Lily was content in Wallace. Their family had scattered and grown, branched out and put down roots in new places, but the core of them remained strong. The love that had started with one exhausted woman and one kind cowboy had grown to encompass all these lives, all these people, all this joy. "Tell me about the future," Annie said, as she often did on these quiet evenings. "Daniel will take over the ranch someday," Dalton said, painting the picture for her. "He's got the skill and the passion for it. Rose will probably run the business side with an iron fist. We'll have grandchildren running all over the place, learning to ride, getting into trouble. We'll grow old together, you and I, and we'll sit on this porch and watch our legacy grow and thrive." "That sounds perfect," Annie said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "How did we get so lucky?" "We made our own luck," Dalton said, echoing her earlier words. "We worked hard, we loved each other, we never gave up. That's the secret, Annie. That's what makes it all work." In 1905, their oldest grandchild was born, Thomas's son, who they named James. Annie held the baby and cried, remembering holding Thomas for the first time after the accident, this terrified 6-year-old boy who had lost his parents. Now that boy was a man with a child of his own, and the circle of life continued its beautiful, inevitable progression. More grandchildren followed over the years. Grace had twin girls. Lily had 2 boys. Daniel eventually married a girl from Coeur d'Alene, and they had 3 children in quick succession. Rose, true to form, waited longer than the others but eventually fell in love with a banker from Boise and had 2 daughters. The ranch that Dalton had dreamed of, that Annie had helped him build, became a family empire. Daniel took over day-to-day operations, but Dalton remained involved, unable to fully retire from the work he loved. Annie continued to manage the household and the family, the heart of everything they had built. In 1915, Annie and Dalton celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a huge party, and Annie looked around at all the faces, so many people whose lives existed because she and Dalton had found each other, had fallen in love, had chosen to build a life together. "What are you thinking?" Dalton asked, coming to stand beside her as she watched the children play in the yard. "I'm thinking about the girl I used to be," Annie said. "Working 3 jobs, terrified all the time, sure I would never be able to give my siblings the life they deserved. I'm thinking about how you walked into my life and changed everything." "You changed everything," Dalton corrected gently. "You were already saving your family, already sacrificing everything for them. I just gave you a hand up, helped you carry the load. You did the hard work, Annie. You and that stubborn determination that wouldn't let you quit no matter how impossible things seemed. We did it together," Annie insisted. "Everything good in my life, in all our lives, came from that choice we made to be together. I love you, Dalton Davies. I loved you 31 years ago when you told me I only needed one job now, and I love you even more today." "And I love you, Annie Davies," Dalton said, pulling her close. "My brave, beautiful wife who works so hard and loves so deeply. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." They danced that night under strings of lights hung in the yard, surrounded by their family, and Annie felt like she was floating. All those years ago, she had been so tired, so overwhelmed, so sure that she would spend the rest of her life just barely surviving. She could never have imagined this abundance of love, this security, this joy. As they grew older, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dalton spent his days working with the horses, training the younger animals, teaching his grandchildren everything he knew. Annie spent her time with the grandchildren, baking with them, reading to them, telling them stories about the old days when she and their grandfather had first started the ranch. They still rode out to the creek sometimes, just the 2 of them, to the place where so much of their story had begun. They would sit on a blanket and remember that day when Dalton had taught the children to ride, when Annie had been too proud and too scared to accept help, when everything had still been uncertain. "Best decision I ever made," Annie said once, watching the water flow over the rocks. "Saying yes to you. Best decision I ever made was asking," Dalton replied, "though I was scared out of my mind that you'd say no." "I almost did," Annie admitted. "I was so afraid of depending on someone, of letting my guard down, of being hurt again, but something in your eyes made me trust you." "I'm glad," Dalton said simply. "I'm glad you trusted me, glad you let me into your life, glad we built all of this together." In 1920, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. 5 decades of marriage, of partnership, of love. The party was even bigger than their 31st anniversary, with children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren in attendance. The ranch had grown into one of the most successful in Idaho, known for producing the finest horses in the region. Annie, now 72 years old, looked around at her family and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Thomas was there with his wife and grown children. Grace had traveled from Spokane with her family. Lily and her husband lived nearby and were there with their sons and daughters-in-law and grandchildren. Daniel ran the ranch with his sons, carrying on the tradition Dalton had started. Rose managed the finances from her home in Boise, but she had come back for the celebration with her family. All of these lives, all of these people, all of this love, it had started with one exhausted woman working 3 jobs and one kind cowboy who had said, "You only need one now." Dalton, now 74, stood up to make a speech at the party. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were still that same bright blue that had captivated Annie so many years ago. 50 years ago, he said, his voice still strong. "I walked into a saloon in Wallace and met the most beautiful, brave, stubborn woman I had ever encountered. She was working herself to death trying to provide for her siblings, and I knew right then that I wanted to help her. More than that, I wanted to be with her, to build a life with her, to love her forever." She said yes, thank God, and everything you see here, this ranch, this family, all of this came from that decision. "Annie, you're my heart, my partner, my everything. Here's to 50 more years." Everyone cheered and raised their glasses, though they all knew 50 more years was unlikely at their age. But the sentiment was there, the promise that their love would last as long as they both lived and beyond. Annie stood and took Dalton's hand. "Dalton walked into my life when I had nothing," she said. "When I was scared and alone and sure I was failing the people I loved most. He looked at me and saw not someone to pity but someone to partner with. He offered me not charity but love. He gave me not just security but a future. Every good thing in my life, everything I'm proud of, everything that matters, it all goes back to that choice we made to love each other. Dalton, you're my hero, my love, my best friend. Thank you for 50 years of everything." They kissed while their family cheered, and it felt like that first kiss all over again, full of promise and hope and love that would never fade. They had a few more good years together. Years of watching their great-grandchildren grow. Years of quiet evenings on the porch. Years of love that had deepened until it was as much a part of them as breathing. They told each other stories about the old days, laughed about mistakes they had made, marveled at how far they had come from that first meeting in the doorway of the Silver Spur Saloon. Dalton died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1923 at the age of 77. He had spent his last evening sitting on the porch with Annie, holding her hand and watching the sunset, and when she kissed him good night, he had smiled and told her he loved her. She found him in the morning, still smiling, gone but at peace. Annie mourned him deeply but without bitterness. They had been blessed with 40 years of marriage, and every single one of those years had been good. She had his love to sustain her, his children and grandchildren to surround her, his legacy in the ranch that still thrived. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by her family, still sharp and still strong despite her age. She spent her time with her great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their great-grandfather, about the Old West, about what it had been like to work 3 jobs and fall in love with a cowboy who had changed her life. On a spring evening in 1928, she asked Daniel to take her to the creek, to the place where so much had begun. He helped her down from the wagon and spread a blanket for her, and she sat there watching the water flow, remembering. She remembered being 19 and terrified, working herself to exhaustion, sure she would never be enough. She remembered Dalton's blue eyes and kind smile, his patience and his love. She remembered their wedding day, the birth of their children, the growth of the ranch, 50 years of choosing each other every single day. "I'm ready," she said quietly to no one in particular, or maybe to Dalton, wherever he was waiting for her. That night, she died in her sleep, peacefully and without pain, her last thought a memory of Dalton's voice saying, "You only need one job now." Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to mourn her and celebrate her life. They told stories about her strength and her courage, about how she had built a family and a legacy from nothing, about how much she had loved and been loved. They buried her beside Dalton on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains and the meadows where the horses still ran free. The headstone read, "Annie Davies, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. She worked 3 jobs until a cowboy said she only needed one." The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family, always successful, always thriving. The story of Annie and Dalton became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, the exhausted woman working 3 jobs and the kind cowboy who had fallen in love with her, who had given her a partnership instead of charity, who had built a life with her that echoed through the decades. And in that life, in that love, in that choice they had made to face the world together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a family, a legacy, and a love story that proved that even in the hardest of times, even when you think you're at the end of your rope, someone can walk into your life and change everything. The creek still flows where they first really talked, where Dalton taught the children to ride, where Annie finally let herself believe that she deserved help and love and a future. The mountains still stand tall over the valley where they built their ranch. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Annie and Dalton are together again, still choosing each other, still in love, still proving that sometimes all it takes is one kind person and one brave heart to change the world.